What was it actually like to be a professional mourner in the Victorian era? Hey, everyone to the Bedside Chronicles. Tonight we're drifting back into the soft gloom of the 19th century. So if you haven't already dimmed the lights, now's the moment. Settle in. Let your shoulders drop a little. Let the weight of the day slide somewhere far away, preferably behind a heavy Victorian curtain where all unsettling emotions were politely smothered, because this evening we're wandering into one of the stranger corners of the past, a profession that sat somewhere between performance art, social obligation, and emotional outsourcing, a job people actually trained for and were paid for and took very seriously. Yes, tonight we're meandering gently into the lives of Victorian professional mourners, women and occasionally men, who made a living by crying on command, or by looking appropriately wilted in public, or by being human mood lighting at funerals. It's soothing in its own melancholy way, a quiet ritual profession, wrapped in heavy fabrics and even heavier expectations. So let's drift, slowly, into their world. Victorian Britain had a relationship with death that can only be described as enthusiastic. They embraced mourning the way modern people embrace seasonal lattes, deeply, sincerely, and with an alarming level of commitment. Black clothing wasn't just a preference, it was a lifestyle, a multi-year lifestyle. Some widows wore mourning for so long their original hair color became a fading legend. And into this culture stepped the professional mourners, people hired to ensure that funerals looked sufficiently tragic. After all, nothing communicated respect for the deceased like paying strangers to sob convincingly at your graveside. We'll start gently with the setting. Imagine early morning fog rolling over a London street. A single figure wrapped in black crepe, a veil so long it trails slightly behind her, gathering a bit of everyday city dust, which, in Victorian London, meant a charming blend of coal ash, horse droppings, industrial pollution, and the general disappointment of the empire. Our mourner walks at a slow, deliberate pace, not too slow. That would seem performative, not too fast. Heaven forbid anyone accuse her of having somewhere else to be. Just the right level of tragic glide, the emotional equivalent of a fainting couch on legs. Professional mourners, or mutes, as they were often called, had a job description that was both extremely specific and absolutely bewildering. Their role was to create an atmosphere, an ambience, a curated emotional aesthetic. They stood outside the deceased's home, totally silent, dressed head to toe in black, holding long staffs wrapped in crepe, sometimes wearing top hats so dramatic they could double as small storage containers. Their presence told passersby, yes, someone in this household has died, and the family would like everyone to know they are taking it very seriously. This was important. Victorians loved an audience. No emotional display was complete without one. The more mourners you hired, the more respectable your grief appeared. It was like catering, only instead of sandwiches, you ordered sorrow. A dozen mourners? A modest tragedy. 2 dozen? A very respectable grief indeed. Entire rows of mourners lining the street. Now that was a family who cared, or, at least, wanted people to think they cared. The quiet irony is that many professional mourners weren't particularly emotional themselves. Some were deeply empathetic, some were simply practical, and some were there because it paid better than textile factory work and involved significantly fewer mangled limbs. Training varied. There were no official academies of mourning, no institute of applied sorrow, but people learned skills. How to cry without sweating, how to tremble on cue, how to maintain perfect posture for hours. how to look grief-stricken while still monitoring how much they were being paid. Some even practiced their expressions in mirrors. Imagine dozens of women in tiny rented rooms, standing before cracked glass, rehearsing subtle lip trembles and tasteful sniffles. Acting schools would later call these micro-expressions. Victorian mourners would have called them Tuesday. Now, Victorian households were full of rituals, and mourners were woven into many of them. For example, when a death occurred, the family would lay out the room. Clocks were stopped, mirrors were covered, windows were open to let the soul drift out, hopefully avoiding the choking fog and finding a cleaner airspace. A wreath would be placed on the door, and then the mourners would be hired, not invited, not requested politely. Hired, as one might hire carpenters or chimney sweeps, except instead of repairing something, their job was to radiate sadness at the correct emotional wattage. Many were women, since society expected women to be naturally more expressive. Victorian men were supposed to feel things only on national holidays. Each mourner's clothing had to be perfectly calibrated. No shiny fabrics. Mourning didn't sparkle. No jewelry except jet. A black gemstone made from petrified wood and fashionable among people who wanted to advertise grief with artisan accessories. Veils had to fall at a precise angle. Gloves had to be black, but not glossy. And everything had to look heavy, dense, oppressively somber. Victorians believed grief should create drag. During the funeral procession, mourners walked in silence, absolute silence. Talking was seen as disrespectful. Smiling was practically a felony. Anything resembling enthusiasm could have led to social catastrophe. They moved as a group, slow, synchronized, gently funereal, like a performance troupe dedicated entirely to the art of looking beautifully miserable. Children occasionally watched them pass and whispered, "Are they ghosts?" Given the fog and the layers of black fabric, it wasn't an unreasonable question. Behind them came the carriage with the coffin, often elaborately decorated, because Victorians approached funerals the way modern people approach themed weddings. And behind that, the family, trying to look deeply bereaved, even if the deceased had been a distant uncle no one particularly liked. Professional mourners helped set the emotional tone. They were the visual soundtrack, the human background music of sorrow. Now, let's drift for a moment into their personal lives. Quiet, complicated, and often ironic. Many mourners were widows, women who had truly lived through grief, and now used that experience to survive financially. Others were older women, no longer able to work in factories. Some were simply gifted at acting. A few were known to be a bit dramatic in their everyday lives, and were gently encouraged to monetize it. Their neighbors often viewed them with a mix of respect and unease. After all, they spent their days around death. And Victorians, for all their enthusiasm about mourning rituals, were still a bit spooked by mortality. Some believed mourners brought bad luck. Others believed they carried spiritual residue. A few even believed mourners could attract ghosts the way candles attract moths. None of these beliefs raised their wages, but for the mourners themselves, it was work, strange work, quiet work. Work that required discipline and the ability not to sneeze dramatically under a veil. One of the more peculiar aspects of the profession was the mourning guilds, informal groups where women shared tips, clothing, and job leads. They helped each other learn things like how to maintain a sorrowful expression for 2 hours without jaw tension, how to discreetly refresh tear stains with a bit of pinched skin, or a dab of water, how to coordinate with other mourners so no one accidentally walked too quickly and disrupted the synchronized sadness. Mourning was, in many ways, a performance, a soft, slow, ceremonial performance, where the audience was the entire neighborhood. And yet, some mourners found peace in their work. The rituals were predictable, the income was steady, the pace was calm. There's a certain tranquility in routine, even if the routine involves funereal accessories. But we can't talk about Victorian mourning without acknowledging the economy behind it. Death was big business. Entire industries thrived on it. Coffin makers, flower sellers, photographers who specialized in post-mortem portraits, and of course the mourning goods shops. Families spent astonishing amounts of money to look appropriately devastated. Appearances mattered. Sorrow was a status symbol. Hiring mourners wasn't merely aesthetic. It signaled wealth. If your grief had employees, you were doing quite well. Despite Victorian melodrama, professional mourners rarely lived glamorous lives. Their pay varied wildly. Their hours were unpredictable, and they were expected to stand outdoors in the cold, the fog, the rain, the occasional hail, and the constant London smell. Fun fact, one 19th century writer described the city odor as a combination of burning coal, wet rope, and something that died in late spring. Professional mourners worked in that, wearing several layers of black wool, while trying not to sweat, lest it stain the fabric. It was a role that required endurance more than tears. Yet despite everything, the gloom, the regulations, the long hours, mourners occupied a strangely respected place in society. They were seen as essential, part of the machinery of mourning, a social lubricant for grief. Without mourners, a funeral could appear rushed, incomplete, or, worst of all, unfashionable. Victorians were terrified of being unfashionable. They would rather wear widow's weeds for 3 years than be caught in the wrong shade of black. So mourners remained in demand, and funerals continued to be some of the most silently dramatic events of the century. And now, as we drift gently toward the end of this part, we begin to sense the quiet weight of their world, the slow-moving ceremonies, the heavy fabrics, the fog-dampened mornings, the rhythmic footsteps in procession. Professional mourners lived in the soft echo between life and death, never fully part of the grieving families, yet always present at the moment when households shifted into silence. Their daily existence was a blend of performance, ritual, and resignation, an occupation that required stillness, composure, and the ability to express an emotion that might not be theirs. A calm, steady melancholy, just convincing enough, just sorrowful enough. A quiet trade in dignified sadness. End of part 1. Part 2. Who were the ice masters of the 19th century? And why did they keep disappearing? Hey everyone, loosen your shoulders a bit. Let the last bit of daylight, or whatever sad, artificial bulb is illuminating your room, fade into the background. Tonight we're sliding quietly into another corner of 19th century history, a cold one, appropriately enough, because nothing says bedtime relaxation quite like Victorian men wandering off into frozen wastelands and mysteriously never returning. So, let's float gently into the world of the so-called Ice Masters, a title that sounded noble, impressive, and maybe even a little mystical, until you learn what the job actually involved. Then it becomes clear it was just shorthand for a man who willingly endangers himself for very little pay and an alarming amount of frostbite. The 19th century adored grand titles like this: Master of Ice, Inspector of Nuisances, Hereditary Keeper of the Royal Bedpan. There was always someone with an unnecessarily dramatic job description created by a bureaucracy desperate to feel interesting. And the Ice Masters definitely fit that Victorian flair for overcompensation, because their work was not glamorous. Not powerful, and certainly not safe, but it was essential. Without ice masters, most cities would have smelled like a warm cheese market in the middle of July. Food would have spoiled instantly. Hospitals would have struggled to store anything perishable. The wealthy would have had to endure drinks at terrifying room temperature, and high society dinner hosts would have been robbed of the ability to serve the ultimate symbol of Victorian culinary excess, the chilled jelly molded into the shape of whatever animal they were currently destroying through colonial import. So, what exactly did ice masters do? Well, the short version is they harvested, transported, and preserved ice. The long version, which is, of course, why you're here, drifts through frozen rivers, collapsing ice houses, suspicious disappearances, and the occasional Victorian man confidently ignoring nature's very clear no trespassing signs. Let's ease into it. Imagine you wake up in 1854. It's winter, and you're somewhere in New England. The sun hasn't risen yet, because the sun is also tired from being alive in the 19th century. You pull on your coarsest wool and head to the river, which is frozen more solidly than Victorian morality. There, you and a few dozen other half-frozen individuals begin sawing long rectangles of ice out of the river. You are an ice master, or at least part of the crew hired by one. The master part simply means you are presumably in charge, though in practice it mostly means that if anyone dies, the paperwork is your problem. Ice harvesting wasn't a hobby. It was an industrial operation. Large teams carved blocks with saws, guided them down channels, and loaded them onto wagons. The blocks were then stacked inside enormous ice houses, structures that looked like wooden barns but functioned more like giant refrigerators powered entirely by hope and sawdust. Sawdust was key. Victorians used it as insulation because they assumed sawdust could solve any problem. It was cheap, it was plentiful, and it didn't actively catch fire unless you looked at it the wrong way. Ice houses stuffed tightly with ice and sawdust could keep ice frozen for months. Some were layered so densely they held ice for years, outlasting multiple mayors, 2 local scandals, and at least one inexplicable Victorian fad involving celery. The work was cold, monotonous, and dangerous. Men slipped into the freezing water. Tools broke. Horses panicked. Ice blocks shifted unexpectedly and occasionally decided to stage a small, deadly rebellion. Ice masters had to predict weather patterns, calculate storage needs, and manage a supply chain entirely at the mercy of the climate, which, as you may recall, is not known for its managerial cooperation. But still, none of this explains why they kept disappearing. That part, as usual, is where things get a little more Victorian. Let's drift first to the commercial side. The ice industry was global by the mid-1800s. New England ice was shipped as far as India, because the 19th century was nothing if not aggressively impractical. Ice masters often traveled with shipments, supervising transport by train, wagon, and ship, and because the job involved extended, freezing journeys across remote landscapes, many ice masters simply vanished. Some were swept overboard during storms. Some went missing after falling between shifting ice floes. Some froze to death in isolated areas and weren't found until spring, at which point they were generally described by newspapers as sad, brave, or, most flattering of all, regrettably crunchy. And of course, some disappearances were less accidental. Ice was valuable, shockingly so. In hot months, it was worth more than butter, sometimes more than meat. and always more than whatever questionable tonic your local apothecary was selling to cure melancholy. Ice shipments were prime targets for thieves. Entire blocks of ice would vanish overnight, and when an ice master tried to stop the theft, well, let's just say there were a few heated arguments about cold products. Competition between ice companies was fierce enough to qualify as its own minor blood sport. Some firms sabotaged rivals by breaking their ice channels or setting fire to ice houses, which is impressive mainly because it reveals how committed Victorians were to arson as a problem-solving strategy. Ice masters caught in the crossfire, or perhaps too close to a dispute, sometimes disappeared under circumstances described by authorities as mysterious, uncertain, or definitely not our department. But there was another reason ice masters kept vanishing, one less violent, and far more Victorian. Bad paperwork. Many ice masters were seasonal workers. They moved frequently and traveled long distances. When someone went missing, it often took weeks before anyone realized. Sometimes they had simply switched jobs. Sometimes they were delayed by weather. Sometimes they were quietly recovering from frostbite in a relative's spare room, under the mistaken belief that their absence was unnoticeable. And sometimes the records were so poorly kept that men who were alive were listed as dead, and men who were dead were confidently expected at work the following Monday. So yes, some disappearances were real, and some were the result of the sort of clerical chaos that could only happen in a century where census takers occasionally wrote cow when the handwriting was unclear. But perhaps the most haunting disappearances happened far from cities and paperwork. Let's drift north, far north, to places like Labrador, Baffin Bay, and the deeper reaches of the Arctic archipelago, regions that became synonymous with the Victorian era's most disastrous obsession, Arctic exploration. Ice masters were indispensable to polar expeditions. They knew how to read ice. They could identify cracks before they formed. They could tell when a floe would hold weight or collapse. They handled freezing stores, protected supplies, and advised on safe passage through labyrinths of ice fields. Basically, they were the people on the ship who knew what they were doing. Naturally, the Victorians placed them lower in the hierarchy than the officers who had no idea what they were doing. These expeditions pushed ice masters into some of the harshest, least forgiving environments on the planet, and many never came back. Some perished during early season thaw, when ice turned into large floating jigsaw puzzles. Some got trapped with crews wintering in frozen bays, slowly starving as morale dropped faster than the temperature. Some attempted overland treks when supplies ran out, leaving only eerily preserved campsites and the occasional abandoned mitten. Victorian newspapers described their disappearances with phrases like "lost to the eternal ice," which sounded poetic, but really meant, we have absolutely no idea what happened, and we're too embarrassed to admit it. One lost ice master could be explained away. 2. Unfortunate coincidence. But when similar disappearances occurred repeatedly, quietly, over decades, the image of the ice master took on a peculiar mystique. Not heroic, not tragic, more like a figure half absorbed into the landscape. Men who blended so thoroughly into the world of cold and silence that eventually, perhaps inevitably, they simply stayed there. And yet, despite all this, the job remained bizarrely appealing to a certain kind of Victorian man, the sort who felt invigorated by discomfort, committed to extremely avoidable risk, and convinced that the universe respected confidence more than competence. There was also status involved. Calling yourself an ice master was far more impressive than admitting you were just a man who specialized in cold storage. It implied knowledge, control, maybe even a touch of mystery. And Victorians loved nothing more than looking important doing something deeply unimportant. Socially, ice masters sat in a curious position, respected by workers, tolerated by merchants, occasionally admired by explorers, and largely ignored by aristocrats who preferred to engage with ice only when it was supporting their afternoon dessert. But despite their rank and file existence, ice masters were crucial. Their work kept cities functioning. Their expertise saved countless ships from sinking. Their decisions influenced entire trade routes and dictated seasonal business cycles. And when they vanished, their absence was noticed, even if somewhat belatedly. Sometimes an entire operation collapsed without its ice master, leaving warehouses full of spoiled food and extremely lukewarm beverages. Other times, the disappearance led to frantic searches through ports and ice fields. And occasionally, years later, someone would stumble upon a clue, a diary page, a scrap of clothing, or the remains of an abandoned camp, and piece together the final days of a man who had slipped quietly from the world of the living into the cold, quiet archives of Arctic history. End of Part 2. Part 3. What did people do before alarm clocks were invented? Hey everyone, let your breathing slow down, unclench your jaw, and settle into that soft, pleasantly numb state where history starts to feel like a half-remembered dream whispered by someone who hasn't slept properly since 1842. Because tonight, we're wandering into one of those deceptively simple questions. A question that sounds charming and harmless when you first hear it. And then, slowly, as the details unfold, becomes very, very Victorian. What did people do before alarm clocks were invented? Well, they improvised, badly, creatively, and occasionally with a level of desperation that suggests humans have always been fighting the eternal battle between I should wake up early and I refuse. But let's drift slowly, gently, through the centuries, tracing the long and surprisingly chaotic history of how people dragged themselves out of bed before the luxury of a shrieking bedside gremlin. For most of human history, people relied on the oldest alarm clock of all, the sun. It rose. People woke. Simple, predictable, an elegant system tragically ruined by the arrival of civilization, work schedules, early morning religious obligations, and of course, humanity's collective desire to sleep just 10 more minutes. Farmers woke at dawn, soldiers woke when shouted at, and monks woke when another monk hit a large piece of metal. But as societies grew, people needed more precise wake-up times. The sun, it turns out, did not care about your meeting, your guild shift, or your complicated medieval dairy responsibilities. So the world began to develop pre-alarm clock alarms. Each culture built its own solution, none of which would ever be described as convenient or humane. Let's drift through them quietly. One of the earliest methods came from ancient Greece. They used water clocks, also known as clepsydra. These were delicate devices involving water dripping steadily from one container to another, and when the water reached a certain level, a mechanism triggered a sound, often a whistle or a small bell, or, if someone felt particularly dramatic, a flute. It's all very serene, very gentle, very soothing, naturally. The Romans looked at this calming invention and decided to make it louder, because the Romans loved volume almost as much as they loved invading things. Some Roman water clocks had whistles so sharp they could probably summon geese from 3 provinces away. But while water clocks worked for temples and public officials, they weren't exactly slumber-friendly. No one had a personal bedside water clock dripping ominously through the night. That sort of luxury wouldn't arrive until much later, so most people continued relying on nature, neighbors, or whatever sound happened to be loud enough to yank them unwillingly into the waking world, which leads us gently into the Middle Ages. If you lived in a medieval town, or near one, your alarm clock was a bell tower, a wonderfully early, loudly communal system in which every citizen was treated to the same wake-up time, regardless of whether they had any intention of being awake. Church bells rang at dawn for morning prayers. They rang for work. They rang for celebrations, funerals, impending plagues, weather anxiety, and any number of exciting medieval crises. If you wanted to sleep in, you simply did not. Bells did not negotiate. Inside monasteries, things were even stricter. It wasn't just bells. They had actual human alarm clocks. Some unlucky monk, usually quite junior, was assigned to stay awake, keep time, and then wake the others at the appropriate hour. How he woke them varied. Some tapped, some whispered, some shook shoulders gently, and some, according to more unfortunate accounts, simply claimed a handbell inches from a sleeping monk's ear and then walked away, presumably for their own safety. But again, most people slept in cottages, not monasteries, and those people woke according to light, chores, and social expectation, which brings us, softly, to the early modern period. Let's drift to the 17th and 18th centuries. This era embraced the great tradition of human solutions to mechanical problems, which is a polite way of saying they hired people to wake other people up. Yes, real people. Professional alarm clocks, known as knocker-uppers. They appeared across Britain and Ireland and became especially famous during the Industrial Revolution. Their job was to wake workers who had to rise before dawn to operate machines, endure long shifts, and contemplate why they hadn't chosen a career that allowed them to sleep past 4:30 a.m. A knocker-upper usually carried a long rod, sometimes a stick, sometimes a cane, and sometimes, when the job demanded extreme precision, a pea shooter. They would walk down dark streets before sunrise, locate the correct window, and tap on the glass, or shoot peas at it until the occupant stirred. The tapping could last minutes or even longer, because knocker-uppers were expected to continue until they saw definite signs of life. A groan, a candle, a hand emerging from a blanket, waving vaguely in the universal gesture of, "Fine, fine, I'm awake. Stop poking my house." The job required patience, good aim, deep familiarity with the neighborhood, and, ideally, the ability to avoid annoyed neighbors who did not order a personal wake-up service and yet still received one at 4 a.m. because thin Victorian walls were terrible. Some knocker-uppers handled entire factory shifts and kept hundreds of workers on schedule. Others were more specialized, taking private clients who needed unusual or extremely early wake-up calls. They were basically human snooze buttons, who unfortunately did not offer the option to oversleep. Some became local legends, like Mary Smith of East London, who was known for her quick pea shooting accuracy and ability to wake a client on the 5th floor without accidentally alerting the other 19 tenants, who wished her nothing but mild harm. Her daughter inherited the job, because nothing says family tradition like launching legumes at strangers' windows in the cold English dawn. But not all pre-alarm wake-up methods were so precise. Many households relied on animals. Roosters, for example, nature's most punctual and least apologetic bird. The rooster, to its credit, delivered a reliable wake-up service. Unfortunately, the service included no unsubscribe button and no customer support. So if you had one, you were waking up at dawn whether you wanted to or not, regardless of your latest bedtime, personal preferences, or mild desire to continue existing in a horizontal state. Dogs were sometimes trained to wake people as well, usually by whining, nudging, or placing a cold nose on an unsuspecting human face. Cats also served as alarm clocks, though usually unintentionally and always with malicious enthusiasm. Families also used children, who, contrary to modern belief, woke up early in every century and immediately demanded breakfast. And because Victorian and pre-industrial households rarely had noise insulation, crying infants often acted as involuntary alarm clocks for entire communities. Then there were the more artisanal methods. In some regions, especially rural ones, people hired watchmen who would patrol through towns, tap their staves on the pavement, and call out the hour. It sounded atmospheric, safe, maybe even a little theatrical, but many watchmen had questionable timekeeping accuracy. Some were drunk, some fell asleep, some recited the wrong hour, which meant waking up to the sound of 2 o'clock and all is well did not necessarily coincide with any known definition of 2 o'clock. Some households used candle clocks, candles with nails inserted at intervals. When the candle burned down far enough, the nail would drop onto a metal dish and make a clattering sound. Very elegant, very flammable. The kind of timekeeping system you embraced only if you had excellent fire insurance or a very, very brave attitude toward risk. Others used hourglasses, flipping them repeatedly throughout the night, an exhausting method that guaranteed one thing. By morning, you were awake mostly from frustration. There were also sunrise assistants, relatives, neighbors, or servants whose job it was to wake you at a specific hour. Sometimes this involved knocking on doors, sometimes gently calling your name, and sometimes hauling your entire mattress upright, depending on how deep your sleep and how limited their patience. But perhaps the most charming solution came from the early 19th century, the invention of mechanical household alarms, some of which were designed by people who clearly wanted to wake sleepers by scaring them half to death. Some alarm chairs tipped the sleeper forward. Some alarm beds shook violently. Some dropped objects. One memorable design involved releasing a caged cricket near the sleeper's ear, which would chirp loudly until captured, or until the sleeper swore off mechanical innovation entirely. The Victorian solution to everything, it seems, was to make it louder, sharper, or unexpectedly insect-based. But all of these methods, despite their variety, shared something in common. They were social, communal, tied to the rhythms of a world where everyone's time was slightly entangled with everyone else's. Alarm clocks, when they finally became common, changed how people woke up. They made it private, individual, a solitary battle fought between the sleeper and a very confident ticking device. Before that, waking up wasn't an isolated task. It was part of the soundscape of the world. Bells, birds, footsteps, neighbors, knocks, dawn light, and human voices threading through narrow streets or soft rural mornings. And while the modern alarm clock offers convenience, there is something undeniably soothing about imagining those older mornings, a time when someone walked through your neighborhood before sunrise, tapping windows gently, when the world woke not in a sudden jolt, but in layers of small, familiar sounds slipping slowly into consciousness. A world where waking up was less mechanical and more like rising to the rhythm of life itself. End of part 3. Part 4. How did a single, misidentified dinosaur bone create a mythical giant? Hey everyone, settle back in, adjust your blanket, wiggle your toes until they find the warm spot, and let your breathing soften into that comfortable rhythm that says, yes, I am absolutely ready to hear about a prehistoric misunderstanding that spiraled wildly out of control. Because tonight, we're drifting into one of my favorite categories of historical chaos. The kind that begins with a totally ordinary person picking up a bone, saying, and then, through a stunning chain of logic that future generations would politely describe as bold, concluding that they had found proof of a giant human who was probably 9 to 15 feet tall and definitely had opinions. This is the story of how one lonely, misidentified dinosaur bone helped create a mythical giant, a giant who marched through folklore for centuries, a giant whom entire towns proudly claimed as a local, despite the minor detail that he never existed, except, of course, as the byproduct of a very confused naturalist with an ancient femur fragment and a dazzling level of self-confidence. So let's drift gently, softly, into the early modern world, where people were fascinated by giant skeletons, surprisingly calm about monstrous possibilities, and spectacularly bad at osteology. Our story begins in the late 1600s, drifting around the scholarly circles of Western Europe. This was a time when people were still puzzling out the natural world with enthusiasm, curiosity, and absolutely no framework for dinosaurs. Dinosaurs were not a thing yet. They had not been named, categorized, or given their own children's cartoon franchise. The concept didn't exist. So when a large fossil surfaced, nobody thought prehistoric reptile. They thought Bible or mythology, or sometimes, more honestly, I have no idea what that is, but it's enormous. So let's assume it belonged to something dramatic, which brings us to the cheerful chaos of early paleontology. Before paleontology existed, one of the earliest giants created through pure fossil-based confusion appeared in England. The story generally drifts around to the village of Stonesfield, a quiet area in Oxfordshire where people occasionally picked up strange, oversized bones and brought them to educated men who were expected to know things. Enter Robert Plot, an English naturalist and the first keeper of the Ashmolean Museum. Plot was a scholarly man, well-intentioned, meticulous in his own way, and blessed with the misfortune of being born before anyone had invented the word dinosaur. In 1677, Plot examined a massive fossilized bone fragment, dark, dense, stone-weighted. It had a distinct curve and an oddly smooth surface. Plot measured it, sketched it, and investigated its structure with scientific seriousness. It was, as later paleontologists would confirm, a partial dinosaur femur, probably belonging to a megalosaurus, one of the earliest dinosaurs eventually identified in Britain. But Plot, unaware that giant prehistoric reptiles were ever a possibility, reached a different conclusion, a very different conclusion. He declared that the bone belonged to an ancient giant human, naturally, because in the 17th century, if a bone was uncomfortably large and no immediately available animal seemed appropriate, scholars leaned heavily toward biblical giant, not because they wanted to impress anyone, well, maybe a little, but because there were few alternative explanations available. The world was young, the Earth's history was short, and all mysteries fit neatly into existing frameworks, or they were hammered into place with academic enthusiasm. Platt illustrated the bone in his book, The Natural History of Oxfordshire. It's a charming woodcut, full of the kind of optimistic labeling that suggests, I'm fairly sure this is a thigh bone, but I'm open to being wrong as long as I sound confident. He even suggested, delicately, that the bone might belong to a race of ancient British giants referenced in folklore. Very convenient, very patriotic, and thus, a dinosaur bone quietly transformed into a mythical giant. Now, you might think, surely people question this? Not really. Platt's interpretation fit comfortably inside the scientific norms of the era, and the idea of giant humans wasn't fringe at all. It was mainstream. Ancient texts mentioned them. Folklore loved them. Even serious scholars believed in them. Because why wouldn't they? No contradictory evidence existed yet. Besides, giant bones surfaced all the time, or at least what people thought were giant bones. Many were mammoth bones, massive, curved, impossible to reconcile with any known creature. Others came from extinct species, from cave bears to whales, dug up far inland and promptly reinterpreted as either giants, heroes, or probably someone from mythology. But let's not think too hard about it. Platt's giant wasn't unique. He simply had excellent timing. His giant thigh bone became a quiet piece of scholarly lore, referenced politely by later writers, and the fossil itself, unfortunately, has vanished, misplaced, damaged, or simply discarded in an era that didn't yet realize what it held. But the story didn't end with Platt. The idea that the bone belonged to a giant inspired others. And because history has a sense of humor, this misidentification helped pave the way for one of paleontology's greatest early revelations. 80 years after Platt examined the mysterious bone, another British fossil enthusiast, William Buckland, the eccentric, brilliant geologist known for eating anything at least once, became interested in Stonesfield's fossils. Buckland was, to put it gently, a colorful figure. He reportedly ate bats, mice, owls, and his ultimate goal was said to be trying every creature on Earth at least once to see which tasted best. The crocodile, allegedly, was mediocre, but Buckland did something much more relevant to history. He revisited the earlier giant bone discoveries. By then, the fossil record had grown. Scholars had more fragments, more pieces, enough to sense that something larger, something reptilian, was coalescing. In 1824, Buckland announced the identification of Megalosaurus, one of the first dinosaurs ever scientifically named. He did not call it a giant human. He did not reference biblical warriors. He did not propose that it was a heroic knight who had unfortunately mislaid his sword. Instead, he said, in polite scientific phrasing, this was probably a giant reptile, and it looks like it would eat you. But Platt's original misidentified bone remained part of the story, a quiet stepping stone on the path to dinosaur discovery, a reminder that knowledge builds on earlier attempts, even incorrect ones. Platt didn't know what he was looking at, but he noticed it, studied it, recorded it, and passed it along for someone else, a century later, to reinterpret in its own sleepy, uncertain way. The mythical giant helped reveal the dinosaurs hiding beneath. But let's drift a little wider now. Platt's giant wasn't the only one born from a fossil misunderstanding. Humanity has a long, proud tradition of turning unexpected bones into legendary creatures. Before dinosaurs were part of the lexicon, enormous fossil remains created all sorts of imaginative solutions. Giant humans, cyclopes, griffins, dragons, titans, biblical warriors, and occasionally, just very large cows. Ancient Greeks, for example, found mammoth skulls on Mediterranean islands. Mammoth skulls have a huge central cavity where the trunk attaches, very convenient for imagining a one-eyed giant. And so the Cyclops wandered into mythology, lumbering peacefully through Homer's imagination. Scythian nomads found Protoceratops fossils and concluded they had discovered the bones of griffins, which is honestly not far off. A beaked, four-legged creature with claws and a terrifying presence? Pretty griffin-ish. Chinese scholars found dinosaur bones and folded them seamlessly into their rich dragon traditions. They didn't argue. They didn't panic. They simply said, "Ah, clearly a dragon," and moved on with elegant confidence. But the British giants, the ones linked to Platt's misidentified bone, were special in their own sleepy way. They weren't fearsome monsters. They weren't violent beasts. They were often portrayed as benevolent, or at least mildly grumpy. Local legends claimed that giant-shaped mountains protected villages, or occasionally hurled rocks when feeling theatrical. These weren't terrifying creatures. They were ancestral, familiar, large, but relatable. Platt's giant became part of this quiet mythos, a prehistoric resident of Oxfordshire, improbably tall, mildly heroic, possibly fond of long walks and lifting heavy objects. A giant created not by intention, but by honest confusion. And what makes the story soothing, almost comforting, is how ordinary it was. A bone was found. Someone tried to make sense of it. They did their best with the information available, and the world made room for their interpretation. Science didn't appear fully formed. It drifted into focus slowly, through mistakes, guesses, revisions, and the occasional scholarly shrug. The path from giant human to dinosaur wasn't a sudden revelation. It was a long, drowsy process stretching across centuries. Platt's misidentified bone wasn't the first mistake, and it wouldn't be the last. But it became one of those gentle pivot points where folklore and science brushed past each other, exchanged polite nods, and continued on their way. Humanity, after all, builds its knowledge one sleepy step at a time. So the next time you hear about a mythical giant, remember that many giants began as fossils, quiet, ancient, patiently waiting for someone to misinterpret them. And as far as historical misunderstandings go, this one was charmingly harmless. A single dinosaur bone, quietly creating a giant, not a monster, not a threat, just a very tall imaginary neighbor wandering peacefully through the landscape of folklore until science finally caught up. End of part 4. Part 5. What was the daily routine of a medieval anchoress? Hey everyone, tonight we're drifting back to one of my favorite categories of medieval career choices, which, much like joining a monastery at age 7 or becoming a royal food taster, sounds devotional and serene on the surface, but becomes increasingly questionable the longer you think about it. So settle in, dim the lights, loosen your shoulders, and let's drift into the soft stone quiet of the Middle Ages, where some people sought spiritual perfection by literally having themselves walled into a room for the rest of their lives. Because of course they did. Tonight, we'll ease our way into the daily routine of a medieval anchoress, a woman who, in theory, wanted to spend her life in contemplative solitude, and who, in practice, had the medieval equivalent of becoming a human houseplant in a bricked-up cubicle. Let's float down the cloister walkway and step quietly into her world. Her day began early, because naturally it did. Medieval timekeeping had two settings: too early and too dark, and an anchoress, sealed into her small cell beside the village church, had no real way to know the time except by listening for the bells. She didn't have windows in any modern sense, just a tiny opening covered in cloth or wooden slats, perfect for austerity. Not so perfect for finding out whether it was dawn or the moon doing its best impression of dawn. Still, she rose when she heard the first bells calling the clergy to matins. To be clear, this didn't mean she was joining them. She wasn't clergy. She wasn't even technically a nun most of the time. Instead, she was what the medieval church politely described as dead to the world, which was their charming way of saying walled in, buried alive socially, and expected not to wander off. Her sleeping space was simple. A straw mattress, maybe. A wooden platform if she was fancy. Many anchoresses slept sitting up, because lying down was considered indulgent, and nothing terrified the medieval religious imagination quite like the idea of comfortable posture. So she would rise, stiff and cold, and begin her morning prayers. These weren't short, depending on which spiritual guide she followed. Her early hours could involve reciting the Psalter, the Office of the Dead, and whatever additional devotions the local priest thought might help keep her spiritually productive, since he was the one supervising the woman he had essentially imprisoned. And there she would be, whispering prayers into the dim hush of her cell, her voice dissolving into stone. Let's take a slow breath here and imagine the room. It's small, perhaps 8 by 10 feet, maybe a bit more if the parish splurged, but they rarely did. After all, this wasn't accommodation. This was a spiritual enclosure. The idea was to minimize temptation, distraction, comfort, and, apparently, circulation. The walls are bare. The floor is packed earth or uneven stone. There's no fireplace, just a niche for a lamp, fueled by expensive oil she was always told to conserve. And the air, well, let's say the phrase, old book smell, would feel fresh and invigorating compared to the quiet musk of a room inhabited continuously by the same person for 20 or 30 years. Her cell had 3 openings. The first was the little window to the church sanctuary. This was her lifeline to the Mass. She couldn't join the congregation, very anti-enclosure, but she could watch, or at least listen, depending on the size of the opening. Some anchoresses took their communion through it. Others simply knelt there while the priest did his best not to seem unnerved by the faint presence of a woman silently staring through a wall slit like a devout medieval cat. The second opening looked out into the world. This one was called the parlor window. It wasn't for decoration. It was for spiritual consultation, which meant that despite the intention of solitude, anchoresses were basically expected to become free medieval therapy services. Villagers came to ask for advice. Women confessed unhappy marriages. Men complained about harvest luck. Young people asked whether their crushes were secretly sinful. And the anchoress, who presumably just wanted to contemplate the divine, became a one-woman emotional support hotline for the entire parish. This was the irony no one ever quite acknowledged. She was supposed to escape the world, yet the world kept showing up at her window, asking questions, and occasionally bringing bread. Her third and final opening was a small hatch through which meals were passed, usually simple food, bread, beans, maybe a bit of fish. Luxury was forbidden, choice was frowned upon, and appetite, while technically allowed, was considered rather unbecoming. Her food arrived quietly and anonymously, delivered by attendants who had sworn to respect her silence, which, in medieval terms, meant they probably talked to the hatch anyway, after morning prayers and whatever early consultation she couldn't avoid. She moved into her first period of reading or contemplation. If she was literate, she might have a religious text. If she wasn't, she relied on memory and meditation. And if she was somewhere in between, which was common, she had a small number of passages she repeated daily, slowly, letting them fill the hours. Time passed strangely in an anchor hold. When your world is the size of a pantry and your schedule is the size of a cathedral, minutes stretch out, wide and heavy, like thick cloth drying in cold air. Late morning brought more prayer, maybe more visitors, maybe a brief meal. Sometimes she worked on handiwork, spinning, embroidery, or tending to whatever small task she had been assigned. But this wasn't a hobby. This was duty. Every medieval vocation needed productivity, even the sealed away ones. And then, in the quiet lull between midday and vespers, she would turn inward. This was the true contemplative time. The manuals for anchoresses insisted on stillness. They wanted her mind to dwell not on the world she had left, but on eternity, which sounds peaceful, until you remember the medieval imagination included a near obsessive awareness of sin, death, judgment, and the dangers of idle thought, because of course it did. So she wasn't relaxing. She was concentrating. She was envisioning the wounds of Christ, the trials of martyrs, the narrowness of salvation, a sort of spiritual endurance exercise performed inside a stone closet. And then, inevitably, someone outside would knock softly on the wall and ask, "Is it a sin if my cousin wants to marry a woman who might be his second cousin, but we're not totally sure?" And the anchoress would sigh, spiritually, and give the medieval equivalent of, "Well, yes, let's drift gently into the evening," because her day still had hours left to fill, and none of them involved what we might call leisure. After vespers, she prayed again. After supper, if she had one, she prayed again. Then came Compline, the night office, the final quiet settling of the day. Her cell, always dim, grew darker. The sounds from the church faded. The village grew quiet, except for the occasional animal or tipsy neighbor doing mediocre singing. And in that darkness, she reflected on her actions, her thoughts, her spiritual condition. Were her meditations focused enough? Had she spoken too kindly to a visitor? Had she experienced even a flicker of impatience? She was expected to catalog these things. Anchoresses were supposed to treat their souls like a medieval gardener treated herbs, carefully, constantly, and with the general expectation that everything tended to wilt dramatically without warning. As she prepared for sleep, the cell grew colder. If she had a blanket, it was thin. If she had comfort, it was voluntary suffering. And if she had doubts, well, those were kept very, very quiet. Few anchoresses ever left the anchor hold. They had undergone a symbolic funeral when they entered. They had sung their own office of the dead. They were, in the eyes of the world, already departed. And yet, they still had to get up the next morning and repeat the entire routine. It's worth pausing here to note that anchoresses weren't all tragic. Some actually thrived in their unusual roles. Julian of Norwich, one of the most famous, produced some of the most comforting, gentle theological writing of the entire medieval period. Her cell was a place of thought, not torment. She welcomed visitors. She offered counsel. She wrote hope into a world not particularly known for it. But most anchoresses were not Julian. They were local women, pious to varying degrees, pressured or inspired by different forces, and left alone with their thoughts for decades. And still, the routine held. Every day, the same bells. Every day, the same prayers. Every day, the same room. And every day, the slow deepening of the idea that devotion wasn't loud or dramatic. It was repetitive, steady, like a candle flame flickering against stone. Let's drift now toward the late night hours in her cell. Most people then believed the night was dangerous. Spirits walked, illness stalked, thieves prowled. But for the Anchoress, the night was simply another stretch of her enclosure, another portion of silence to inhabit. She lay down carefully. She tried not to breathe too heavily, because the air in her cell wasn't exactly circulating, and she listened to the world outside, a world she was no longer part of, except through her tiny windows. Eventually, sleep came. No soft bedding, no warm blankets, just a thin mattress, a cloistered quiet, and the feeling of being both near the world and entirely removed from it. When morning arrived, she woke and began again. The same prayers, the same silence, the same tiny pulses of human contact through a wall. That was her life, a life chosen or assigned for holiness, a life made of stone, prayer, and the quiet duty of witnessing humanity from a safe, bricked up distance. Let's drift now to a gentle close, because her routine was long, and her world was small, and her existence, strange as it may seem, was one of the most respected spiritual callings of the medieval age. And tomorrow, she would simply do it all again. Good night.